solitary confinement is considered one of the harshest forms of punishment. A practice used in various prisons worldwide, it isolates prisoners from any human interaction, leaving them alone in their cells for extended periods. Some prisons are notorious for their solitary confinement conditions, and one of the most infamous of these is the Pelican Bay State Prison, located in Northern California. Within this facility lies the Security Housing Unit, SHU, where inmates are placed in isolation, sometimes for decades. Pelican Bay opened in 1989, designed to hold the state's most dangerous and violent offenders. The SHU was meant to control gang members and those who posed an ongoing threat to prison order. However, over time, it became infamous for its brutal conditions. Inmates are confined to small, windowless cells for 22 to 24 hours a day, with only minimal contact with the outside world. They are allowed to make phone calls, but these are limited. Mail is often censored, and visits are rare and highly controlled. The cells are sparse, containing only a metal toilet, a sink, a bed, and a small desk. The walls are bare, and the floors are cold concrete. There's no natural light, and prisoners have little to no access to recreational activities. The harshness of these conditions leads to mental deterioration. Many of the prisoners who experience long-term solitary confinement report suffering from depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and suicidal thoughts. Psychologists and human rights advocates have long warned about the psychological toll of solitary confinement. Studies have shown that prolonged isolation can lead to significant mental health issues, including irreversible brain damage. Inmates may lose their ability to communicate, feel disconnected from reality, and experience severe emotional distress. Some may develop psychosis, where they lose touch with reality, and they often struggle to reintegrate into general population units after their release from isolation. Despite these well-documented effects, Pelican Bay's SHU continued its harsh practices for years, with inmates serving years of solitary confinement, some even decades. The most infamous cases involved prisoners who had spent decades locked away with little to no contact with the outside world. This practice drew widespread criticism from human rights organizations, including the United Nations, which condemned it as cruel and inhumane. One of the most notable protests against these conditions was the hunger strike led by inmates in 2011. Over 6,000 prisoners participated in the strike, demanding better treatment and an end to the long-term solitary confinement. They called for changes to the policies that had allowed prisoners to be placed in solitary confinement for decades without a clear path to release. The strike lasted for more than 2 months and brought international attention to the issue. While the hunger strike did not immediately result in sweeping changes, it did prompt a review of the policies surrounding solitary confinement in California prisons. Some reforms were introduced, including a reduction in the number of inmates placed in the SHU and a reevaluation of the use of solitary confinement for those considered gang affiliates. However, critics argue that these changes are not enough to address the underlying issue of mass incarceration and the overuse of solitary confinement across the United States. In addition to the mental toll of solitary confinement, there is a growing body of evidence suggesting that it may be ineffective in rehabilitating prisoners. While the intention behind solitary confinement is often to punish or control, research shows that it can have the opposite effect, increasing aggression and worsening behavior. This has led many experts to question the efficacy of solitary confinement as a deterrent and to call for alternatives that focus on rehabilitation rather than isolation. The prison system in the United States is one of the largest in the world, and solitary confinement is a practice that is used in many facilities across the country. However, Pelican Bay's SHU stands out because of the sheer length of time that many prisoners spend in solitary confinement. Some have been held in isolation for over 30 years, a situation that is almost unparalleled in other institutions. Despite the harsh conditions, the SHU at Pelican Bay has continued to operate for decades. Many inmates who enter the facility find themselves trapped in a cycle of isolation, with no clear end in sight. The lack of a meaningful parole system for those in solitary confinement has led to a sense of hopelessness and despair. Some prisoners eventually die in the SHU, their mental health irreparably damaged by the isolation. While Pelican Bay is often cited as a prime example of the extreme conditions in solitary confinement, it is by no means unique. Many other prisons across the country have similar units where inmates are placed in isolation for extended periods. The use of solitary confinement is particularly prevalent in supermax prisons, which are designed to house the most dangerous individuals in the criminal justice system. Supermax prisons are a special type of high-security facility where prisoners are isolated from the general population due to their violent or disruptive behavior. These prisons often employ solitary confinement as a primary method of control, leaving prisoners in their cells for 23 hours a day. Some of these prisons have similar SHU units, where conditions are even more extreme and the isolation is even more prolonged. The controversy surrounding solitary confinement has led to calls for reform from various organizations and advocacy groups. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, has been particularly vocal in its opposition to the practice, arguing that it violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Other groups, such as the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, have also called for an end to the use of solitary confinement, especially for vulnerable populations like juveniles and individuals with mental health issues. There have been some signs of progress in recent years, with several states implementing reforms aimed at reducing the use of solitary confinement. In 2019, New York passed the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, which significantly reduced the length of time that individuals can be placed in solitary confinement. Other states, such as Colorado and Maine, have also implemented similar reforms. Despite these efforts, solitary confinement remains a widespread practice in the United States, and many advocates argue that the reforms do not go far enough. There is a growing recognition that solitary confinement is not only ineffective but also damaging to both the individual and society as a whole. As the conversation surrounding prison reform continues to evolve, it is likely that the future of solitary confinement will be a major point of contention. One of the most troubling aspects of solitary confinement is the impact it has on mental health. Research has shown that prolonged isolation can lead to a variety of psychological issues, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. In extreme cases, individuals who have been in solitary confinement for extended periods may experience hallucinations, paranoia, and dissociation from reality. The toll of solitary confinement on mental health is particularly concerning when it comes to vulnerable populations, such as individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions. Many prisoners who are placed in solitary confinement already have a history of mental health issues, and the isolation exacerbates their conditions. This raises important ethical questions about the treatment of individuals with mental health disorders in the prison system. In addition to its impact on mental health, solitary confinement also raises questions about the effectiveness of the criminal justice system. Many advocates argue that the focus of the system should be on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Solitary confinement, by its nature, is not rehabilitative. It isolates individuals from the outside world and deprives them of the opportunity to engage in meaningful activities that could help them reintegrate into society. There is also the issue of fairness. Critics argue that solitary confinement is often used disproportionately against certain groups, including people of color, individuals with mental health issues, and those who have been convicted of nonviolent crimes. These individuals are often subjected to harsher punishment than others, further contributing to the cycle of inequality in the criminal justice system. In conclusion, the prison where no one survives solitary confinement serves as a powerful example of the human cost of mass incarceration and the overuse of isolation as a form of punishment. The extreme conditions in places like Pelican Bay's SHU highlight the need for reform and the importance of addressing the psychological and emotional toll of solitary confinement. While some progress has been made, there is still much work to be done to ensure that the prison system treats individuals with dignity and respect, rather than subjecting them to prolonged isolation and suffering. The fight against solitary confinement is far from over, but with continued advocacy and a growing recognition of its harmful effects, there is hope that future generations will see a more humane and rehabilitative approach to criminal justice. The key to this change lies in focusing on rehabilitation, education, and support rather than isolation and punishment. It is only through this shift in approach that we can hope to build a criminal justice system that truly serves the best interests of society. While solitary confinement has been condemned by many human rights organizations, the challenge remains in finding effective alternatives. The system of mass incarceration in the U.S. has created a vast network of prisons that often prioritize punishment over rehabilitation. Prisoners in solitary confinement, particularly those in supermax units, can spend years in isolation without access to education, therapy, or even meaningful social interaction. This neglect leads to the further degradation of mental health and increases the likelihood of recidivism once individuals are released back into society. The long-term isolation of inmates can contribute to an increasing sense of alienation. Inmates in solitary confinement often experience a deep sense of disconnection from the outside world, which can result in a loss of hope. Without access to programs or activities that could help develop new skills or even offer emotional support, many of these individuals struggle to maintain a sense of identity. This phenomenon is exacerbated by the fact that many prisoners are not given adequate resources to address their mental health needs. It is also important to understand the racial disparities in the use of solitary confinement. Research indicates that people of color, particularly Black and Latino men, are disproportionately placed in solitary confinement. This systemic issue is part of a broader pattern of racial inequality within the prison system, where individuals from marginalized communities are often subjected to harsher treatment. This bias not only exacerbates the suffering of those incarcerated, but also perpetuates cycles of disadvantage that extend beyond the prison system into broader society. A key aspect of reforming solitary confinement practices is shifting the focus away from punitive measures and towards rehabilitation. Rehabilitation-oriented models of incarceration emphasize education, therapy, and vocational training. These programs help individuals develop the tools they need to reintegrate into society, ultimately reducing recidivism. While the transition from punitive to rehabilitative methods may be challenging, it is essential for the long-term success of reform efforts. Efforts to reform solitary confinement also include promoting restorative justice practices. Restorative justice focuses on healing the harm caused by crime rather than simply punishing the offender. By addressing the root causes of criminal behavior, such as trauma, substance abuse, or mental illness, restorative justice offers an alternative path to reintegration. Through dialogue and community involvement, restorative justice helps offenders take responsibility for their actions while also addressing the needs of victims. Public pressure has been instrumental in sparking conversations about prison reform. The visibility of solitary confinement abuses has garnered attention from the media, human rights groups, and the public. High-profile cases of inmates who have spent decades in isolation have ignited widespread outrage, forcing lawmakers and correctional authorities to confront the issue. However, the challenge remains in turning public outrage into concrete action that leads to policy change at both the state and federal levels. One of the most significant obstacles to reform is the belief that solitary confinement is necessary for maintaining prison order. Many corrections officers and administrators argue that isolation is an essential tool for controlling violent or disruptive inmates. However, this argument fails to acknowledge the harm that isolation causes to both the individual and the broader prison system. The cycle of isolation, deprivation, and mental deterioration ultimately undermines the very goal of maintaining order. Reform advocates also highlight the importance of providing mental health care to prisoners, especially those in solitary confinement. Studies show that many individuals in isolation have pre-existing mental health conditions that are exacerbated by the conditions of confinement. Without access to appropriate treatment, these individuals are more likely to experience severe mental health crises, including suicidal ideation. Providing adequate mental health care is not only a moral imperative but also a pragmatic solution for reducing the negative impact of solitary confinement. Education and rehabilitation programs have been shown to significantly reduce the likelihood of reoffending. Incarcerated individuals who participate in educational programs are more likely to find employment upon release and reintegrate into society successfully. These programs also help foster a sense of purpose and self-worth, which can combat the feelings of hopelessness that are common among those in solitary confinement. The lack of such programs in isolation units further compounds the negative effects of confinement. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to limit the use of solitary confinement for vulnerable populations, including juveniles, pregnant women, and individuals with mental health disorders. In 2015, the U.S. Department of Justice issued new guidelines that ban the use of solitary confinement for juveniles in federal prisons. These guidelines reflect a growing recognition that the emotional and psychological development of young people can be severely impacted by isolation, leading to long-term consequences. In addition to legislative reforms, advocates for prisoners' rights are working to raise awareness about the human cost of solitary confinement. Documentaries, books, and news articles have provided an inside look into the devastating effects of isolation, giving a voice to those who have been silenced by the system. These efforts have been instrumental in changing public perceptions of solitary confinement and highlighting its inhumanity. Despite these efforts, solitary confinement remains widespread, particularly in state prisons. Many states continue to use isolation as a tool for managing inmates, even in the face of mounting evidence of its negative effects. This entrenched system of isolation is difficult to dismantle, as it is deeply woven into the fabric of the U.S. prison system. However, as more individuals and organizations continue to challenge the practice, there is hope for lasting change. Another important aspect of reform is addressing the conditions in which solitary confinement occurs. Many advocates argue that the physical conditions of isolation units, such as inadequate lighting, poor ventilation, and lack of access to basic human needs, contribute to the psychological harm experienced by inmates. Reforming these conditions is essential for mitigating the harm of solitary confinement, though it is not a substitute for ending the practice altogether. The impact of solitary confinement extends beyond the individual prisoner. Families and communities are also affected by the isolation of incarcerated individuals. Inmates who are placed in solitary confinement often lose contact with their families, and the emotional toll on loved ones can be devastating. Families may experience feelings of grief, frustration, and helplessness, knowing that their loved ones are suffering in isolation without the support they need. One of the main arguments for ending solitary confinement is the belief in the inherent dignity of every human being. Regardless of the crimes they have committed, individuals who are incarcerated still retain their human rights. Subjecting anyone to prolonged isolation without meaningful opportunities for rehabilitation is a violation of those rights. Human rights organizations around the world have condemned the use of solitary confinement as a form of torture, underscoring the importance of treating incarcerated individuals with respect and humanity. International law also plays a role in the movement to end solitary confinement. The United Nations has been a vocal critic of the practice, particularly as it relates to long-term isolation. In 2011, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture issued a report that specifically addressed the use of solitary confinement, calling for an end to the practice in cases where it is used for prolonged periods. This report has been instrumental in shaping global discussions about prison reform and the treatment of prisoners. Despite the international outcry over solitary confinement, the practice continues to be used in many countries around the world. Some countries, such as the United States, rely heavily on solitary confinement as a tool for managing their prison populations. In contrast, other countries, such as Norway, have taken steps to reduce or eliminate the use of solitary confinement altogether, focusing instead on rehabilitation and reintegration. These countries have demonstrated that it is possible to create humane prison systems that prioritize the well-being of inmates. While the road to reform is long, there is reason for optimism. The momentum for change is building, driven by both public outcry and the tireless efforts of advocates, activists, and organizations working to end the practice of solitary confinement. With continued pressure and a growing recognition of the harm caused by isolation, it is possible to imagine a future where solitary confinement is no longer used as a standard practice in the U.S. prison system. One of the most compelling arguments for reforming solitary confinement is the potential for societal benefit. A prison system that focuses on rehabilitation, mental health care, and education is more likely to reduce recidivism and lower the overall crime rate. Incarcerated individuals who receive the support they need to address the root causes of their behavior are more likely to reintegrate into society successfully, leading to a reduction in crime and a safer, more just society. It is also important to recognize the role of public opinion in shaping the future of solitary confinement. As more people become aware of the devastating effects of isolation, the pressure on lawmakers and corrections officials to enact reform will continue to grow. Public opinion can be a powerful force for change, and the growing movement to end solitary confinement is proof that collective action can lead to meaningful progress. The fight against solitary confinement is not just about ending a harmful practice. It is about reimagining the entire prison system. It is about creating a system that values human dignity and promotes rehabilitation rather than punishment. It is about recognizing that every individual, regardless of their past, deserves a chance to heal and change. And it is about building a society where the focus is on redemption, not retribution. In the coming years, we may see significant progress in the movement to end solitary confinement. As more states and countries take action to reduce the use of isolation, the hope is that the practice will eventually be abolished altogether. Until then, the fight continues, driven by the belief that every person, no matter their past, deserves the opportunity to live a life of dignity, respect, and hope. The long-standing practice of solitary confinement has proven to be one of the most controversial and harmful aspects of the prison system. However, as awareness grows and momentum builds, there is a growing belief that change is possible. Through advocacy, policy reform, and a shift in public opinion, the goal of ending solitary confinement is within reach, offering a more humane and effective approach to justice. Ultimately, the success of these efforts will depend on the collective will to confront the deep-rooted issues within the prison system and to create a system that prioritizes rehabilitation, dignity, and human rights. The road to reform may be long, but the future holds the promise of a prison system that better serves both incarcerated individuals and society as a whole.